Thank you for tuning in to the Bonsai Wire podcast. For this episode, we were hoping to get recorded, edited, and sent out before the big storm hit most of the country. We got it recorded, but ultimately we lost power for a week, so we're just now getting around to editing and sending it out. I hope everyone is safe and hope you enjoy.
Well, I like John's idea to talk about something timely like repotting. I don't know if you all.
This is great.
I don't know if you all have started yet. I'm definitely getting late to be repotting at this point.
So are we. We're waiting for a snowstorm coming tomorrow, and as in years past, we've just tried to minimize the things that we absolutely have to protect when things get kind of cold to the amount of available protection space.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That sounds about right. But I've had actually more challenges dealing with repotting, or at least more questions have come up with repotting this year than in a lot of years. Usually I think of it as the slog that you have to get
That's
through.
Good. I think that's really good because repotting is just sort of the foundation, right?
Well, repotting's always been one of my favorite things, and it's just always this big mountain of work. But this year I'm finding more questions are coming up about degree or extent. How much soil should I remove from that old tree? What exact mix should I use? Because I use kind of custom mixes for almost every tree I repot in the garden. And I'm curious, like, do you guys have a much more streamlined approach to that? I used to, but now I do different things for different
We're kind of knuckleheaded. No, we just do two mixes really. Well, no.
Really for the whole garden?
No. For trees in bonsai pots, yes, but for the back 40, it's a third mix with some organic in it.
Still only three mixes instead of one per tree.
Right. It's pretty dumb. In the back 40 for the things that are sort of young and on the way to find out. It's a fair bit of bark and steer manure, which gives sort of a slow release over 2 to 3 years. Even though we're still fertilizing it, it gives sort of that background fertilizer that's kind of nice. And what are we doing now, John? It's something like 80% pumice, and then the rest that bark steer mix.
Composted bark steer.
And we'll even grow conifers in that, but. You just get a bigger, bolder growth response from using organics. So we do that. I think it gives a little bit of an advantage.
I tried that mix for pines and found it challenging to keep them green when there's a lot of pumice. I've tried it many different ways, and high pumice, no akadama, and I don't care what else. It works for a year or two, and then all of a sudden I just can't keep pines green after that. Doesn't matter how much fertilizer.
Interesting.
So I'll have to keep trying. But this year I'm trying the opposite, 100% lava on the pines. We'll see how that goes.
Whoa.
That's very mineral. Yeah, that might work. There's a lot of iron in there.
I have some chojubai in it, and they already look a little different than I expected. So I'll be curious how that goes too.
Are you using red lava or black lava?
Red lava. And I rinsed it in water once. So I figure
wise.
I know it's possible for it to work. I just need to figure out what the recipe is going to be.
Yeah.
Well, so what about your other two bonsai pot mixes? So whether it's a young tree or an old tree, as long as it's in a bonsai pot, it gets the same mix?
Pretty much. Yeah. We sort of divided into roughly deciduous and conifer, though some of the conifers, such as spruce and hemlock that like a lot of water, will throw into the deciduous mix, which is sort of a 50-50 akadama pumice mix. And then the conifer is just 1/3 akadama and the rest is pumice. And I'm pretty sure I would have slightly greener, to your point, Jonas, I would have slightly greener pines if I used more akadama, but we're trying to figure out a way to keep our akadama use kind of low. So anyway, we've been doing that for years. My teacher, Suzuki, in Japan, we had a lot of deciduous trees. For a Japanese master who isn't really specializing in deciduous, he had quite a few. Maybe 20% of the garden was deciduous, and he didn't use any lava at all, the scoria. And I think, given what Joe Harris has found, that there was And I think even Ryan recently, kind of an overabundance of boron, which is what Ryan assumed, I think was his problem, probably rightly, because Joe Harris had a lab that found a level of toxicity that was pretty scary. Was that the black? I can't even remember. Was it the black lava?
I think that was the red.
The red.
Oh, was it the red? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you're washing Jonas might be a good idea. But yeah.
Well, what's funny is if there's
I don't know.
toxic boron in it, the people have been using red
Yeah.
lava for decades and no
I
one's
think it's
seen
just
even the start of a symptom. And so
Right.
it just seems
Right.
really weird that
I think it's
I just would love to know what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah. It's probably just where they're getting a particular batch. Yeah. In the mountains.
And I know they do change batch to batch big time. The color, the shape, the density, the weight, even pumice, the weight can change radically. I just learned this year from when they open up a new vein of pumice, the rock comes out way, way heavier. It's more dense. And then as they get deeper and deeper in, it gets lighter and lighter. And so I just from batch to batch, there can be like almost double the density in the particles.
Wow. So maybe we were using sort of on the surface new vein pumice in Japan. I was also surprised how heavy the pumice was there.
Was that the normal Hugo that you used?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Which usually is fairly light in Japan.
I thought it was heavier than what we're using here, but there's definitely an awful lot of variability. Even scoria. I mean, there's some stuff that frankly feels like pumice, but it's red or black. So some of the lavas can be can also be really heavy, like rock heavy,
very, very,
very solid. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious.
So Jonas, so basically what are your mixes? What kind of things are the variables in your mixes?
I go for deciduous. I go up to 80% Akadama, and I'd probably start at around 30%. I find the really young trees, I tend to use less Akadama, and the more refined trees, more Akadama. Up to probably 60 to 80% in conifers, but usually more around 50, 60%. But yeah, definitely up to 80% for the deciduous. And it's funny, I do notice fairly big differences. I'll also do possibly less Akadama with sicker trees and things that are less healthy. Like if I want to jumpstart a tree, I'll cut down the Akadama, try to hit it more like 30%. But it's like, growing up using, in bonsai at least, using the 30-30-30 mix, or the 1-1-1, pumice, Akadama, and lava. I think that is it's a fantastic mix for middle stage development, which is most bonsai in America, which is, I think, why so many people have so much success with it. Good for young trees, good for getting so healthy trees out of really horrible soil, and it just really jumpstarts them. But when I want the smallest internodes and I want to water less frequency, I want more Akadama and or smaller particles so I can get that more refined growth in there. That's the idea. Whether or not that's happening, we'll see.
No, I think I mean that's a lot closer to what the Japanese do. They're using 70% Akadama, and then the rest is pumice lava mix usually, and it makes total sense to me. And having said that, we only use 3 mixes is not really true. We'll futz according to what we're working with, and we definitely use more pumice with trees that are weaker, that have had root issues, or just need a little bit of a burst of gas.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny, air is really all it takes to do that. A little bit of extra pumice, and it just seems to make things healthy. Not that you all have a ton of them probably, but I noticed California live oak can deal with a ton of pumice. They love it. And redwood, native to the same place, and they love lots and lots of Akadama.
Right.
They want lots of water. They dry out like crazy.
Yeah, kind of like a beach.
But the other, actually on the topic of soil mixes, I'm curious, like Andrew, when you travel, do you recommend super simple mixes for everyone you're working with? Or do you find that people have, based on what's available, kind of different approaches to putting it together?
I think most of the time I recommend super simple mixes.
Nice.
Just a 50-50 mix, Akadama pumice for deciduous, and 1/3 akadama, 2/3 pumice, maybe a handful of lava for the conifers. But what I'm really recommending to people is with young trees, don't use akadama. Try and find a substitute like pumice or perlite to really save cost on the bags, because we're washing the soil away so much more, and it just doesn't make sense.
What around the country you're finding are the best alternatives for people that don't have scoria or pumice readily available?
Perlite, I think, is the best one. Perlite you can get pretty much anywhere. I've noticed the tricky thing with perlite is finding a larger particle, so not just the dust that you typically see if you go to Home Depot and look for perlite.
Has anyone seen good results with either diatomaceous earth or expanded shales or any of those Midwest alternatives that are so common?
I haven't.
We just jumped right into the soil controversy, huh? I thought we were doing a
we did.
repotting one.
I have seen some very minimal root systems in expanded shale. I've had very little experience. Years ago when I was toying around with all kinds of different media, I did try diatomaceous earth, and what I had broke down into something that roots were okay with, but they didn't seem all that excited about it. I've heard that there's some that holds together or breaks down a little slower, which tends to assist, I think, a root colonization, which then can ramify into something that's a little more broken down later after a few years. So that would be ideal if that's out there. But I didn't explore it enough. How about you? Have you explored?
We don't just have a lot of those soils that I keep hearing about all over the rest of the country. And so I've experimented more with other things. I'd actually recommend decomposed granite before I would recommend a lot of the weird particles that do odd things with how much moisture they do or don't hold, because down in Shikoku, they use 100% very close to decomposed granite. And that's what the pine growers use. It's what's in the ground. And even in the bonsai pots, like, you're controlling moisture retention through particle size at that point, but it's not giving you any weird minerals. It's not doing anything unpredictable with the retention, since there's so little microporosity. It works just fine.
Yeah, if you sift it well and you choose your size right, you can do pretty well. I think particularly with conifers, that's not a bad starting place.
Yeah, with deciduous, it'd be interesting because you'd need to go small enough to retain the water. I've not experimented with high amounts of that with deciduous. That'd be interesting, but
it would be.
But for conifers, if you have a 3/16, 1/4 inch, 5/16, I think that'd be really easy to use, and that's available in a lot of places.
Maybe if you're growing a maple in the Hoh National Rainforest or something, it would work great.
Yeah. But what's funny is if you had decomposed granite and you put a little perlite in, it would probably have the recipe to do really well, and you'd get so much stronger lifting those pots all the time.
Right. And it's both a wonderful thing about perlite and the one negative that you could. I love it, especially if you're growing a young plant in a nursery pot or something like that. Perlite is great. The problem is it floats away, but you just put something else on top of it and hold it down. Sphagnum moss or something like that can work.
Now, Jonas, how much would you say you're recommending decomposed granite because you sell tools? Like, is there a correlation between tools selling and?
I would just keep the lava at that point, and I don't use much lava myself in general.
Lava will do it. That'll erode your tools to nubs.
I would just love to hear. It's really interesting how popular the lava pumice mix got, because I've yet to see any evidence that leaving out one or the other makes a big measurable difference. I've done 2/3 lava, 1/3 akadama, and we've all done 2/3 pumice for over a decade, and I have just not seen big difference other than jagged scissor blades and heavier pots. I know they have different moisture retaining capabilities, but I have not yet seen with proper watering trees exhibit different characteristics as a result of leaving one or the other out.
Interesting.
So I always tell people, aim for your target percentage of akadama, and 30 to 50 are really safe targets. And so have you guys been exposed to any data when you're doing a mix?
I've actually seen
I have a client in Dallas, Texas, and I was actually just there, and we were repotting. The last few years we were repotting all these deciduous trees that were in the standard boon mix, maybe with just a little bit of lava or extra lava in them. And they just, they were in these containers for 4 or 5 years, and I'd pull them out and there'd be like no roots there. And we experimented putting them in either pure pumice or just 50-50 mix. And within 1 year, they had better roots than the whole 5 years that they were in the pots previously. So I've seen a lot, and not just with that Dallas client, but when we take the lava away, particularly with deciduous trees, I see, much, much, much better root growth.
I'm really curious about this because I've wondered at length whether this is why Suzuki did not use lava, because he had so many deciduous trees in the garden, whereas other Japanese masters were using some lava. I have heard storylines. I've never seen studies, but I would love to see them if there's too much minerality in lava for deciduous, whether that's a problem. But you were finding low root growth, Andrew, even with some conifers then?
Even with black pines, and
Really?
and it could have just been he had a bad lava source.
Well, that's what I'm curious about, whether we're going to play Russian roulette with our lava.
Right.
It's worth it.
Yeah, I mean, we put stuff in pure pumice, we put stuff in 50-50, and the roots just totally exploded. Same containers, same fertilizing regimen, all of that. But just
I'm also curious about the watering, because I know that they have very different moisture retentive capabilities. And if you use different mixes and water the same, that can be death to the roots. And so a lot of times lava holds way, way more moisture than pumice. And so if you're watering them the same, you're going to be drowning the things in lava and they're not going to grow at all. That's definitely the number one takeaway. I used to start batches of pines where I would use 10 different mixes. And if I watered them the same, you're forcing the results of the study based on bad watering. The hard thing is using 10 different soils and watering appropriately 10 different ways.
Right.
So in addition to potential toxicity, I'd be curious about what the watering difference is. Because I know that garden I went to in Japan where the guy uses 100% lava for all of his trees, and that's the appropriate size lava. He has deciduous and conifers in nothing but 100% lava the entire lives. And having spoken with people who've repotted these trees in Japan, they're like, oh my God, please start using this at home. The roots are fantastic. That was the feedback I got. So it's not necessarily an inherent thing to lava, but I am also not going to say I know what the differences are that are going to make it work better or worse in different cases. But between toxic dust, if that's a thing, and water, those are the ones I'm most curious about. But that's good to hear, Andrew. That's interesting.
Citizen science experiments. We need a few of them regarding these issues.
Yeah.
So I had in my notes, I was curious to hear everybody's thoughts about what clues. I'm moving on to a slightly different repotting topic here, of repotting timing. When do we repot something? And in my view, it's multiple clues. I hate calendars. I think they're useless. Repot your pines every 4 years. Repot your deciduous trees in the spring of every 3rd year. Those are useful guidelines, but they really don't work in usual life, because we have to look at the health of the tree. We have to look at if there's a possible root issue. Many people, there's one other little clue that I think we tend to miss, which is internode length. If you have an azalea or something like that, internode length is one of the best clues. Bad compacted waterlogged soils, reading these signs rather than the calendar, I think is really, really helpful. And the main tool that we use in our backyard is just a sharpened chopstick, and you poke it into the soil near the pot lip. So not in the core, which is probably always going to be tight, but in the area that you're removing and replacing every few years to see if that is tight. The tricky thing I find is that I have a very poor memory for how a tree was draining the summer before when we were watering it a lot, because when we're potting, we're not watering a lot. And so you're not going to water it to see whether, how it's draining. Right. Either you have a great memory or just use a chopstick. But that's sort of the main tool that we use. But I'm curious what you guys think about repotting timing.
Or frequency in that case.
What do you guys do? Yeah, frequency. Yeah.
Yeah, like Andrew, how do you teach that one? Because I know again you're working with people, so how do you go about that?
Yeah, I do the same chopstick method that Michael was just talking about. I think that works great. What I'm finding is lately I'm doing younger trees a lot more frequently, just especially with deciduous, just so I can really splay out the roots
Yep.
and really edit them. So I'm almost doing the seedlings and up to the first 5 or 7 years. I'm almost doing those every year just to really splay them out and give them a good foundation before I start leaving them alone for longer periods of time. But yeah, it's a tricky thing to teach. I think, when I was a bonsai hobbyist, I think looking back, I repotted things way too frequently.
Yeah.
And after doing the apprenticeship and doing this professionally, now I'm leaving things in the pots a lot longer. Particularly even species that are really strong, like a trident, leaving them an extra year or two to really help slow them down and get small internodes. Almost to the reverse of what Michael was saying, where while that can be a clue, it can also be a tool to use to slow down a plant.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I find that generally it's longer in between than we think for repotting times.
And based on, I think, how other people are teaching this in general, I mean, I almost don't know that I have an example of people who on average don't repot too frequently. It's pretty much the default is a lot of people I know repot every year. I'll never understand that. And I agree about the calendars. It's funny. It's been 10, 15, maybe 20 years since it's occurred to me to even take into consideration when a tree was last repotted, because it just, the health of the tree, the character of the soil, all of that is really what matters.
Right. Healthy trees, can compact to the point where you can't penetrate with water very well 2 years sooner than what a calendar might tell you to repot. And then a weak tree, a diseased tree, is moving so slowly that it can be 2 or 3 years longer than what a calendar might tell you what to do. So that's where this chopstick and what Andrew's talking about, you can use your repotting schedule timing as a tool to slow things down, or conversely to speed things up if it's weakened to the point. I think it's one of the problems we have with very old mature bonsai is that the twigs can start to get so thin that our vascular pathways are super minimal. And at that point, we want to speed it up just a little bit, or we're going to start losing some twigage. And that's where your repotting schedule for a few cycles might be a little bit closer to introduce a little bit of youth again. That's one of the interesting things about trees. It's true that they have a sort of a genetic ability to reach certain ages, but they're also kind of timeless in a way, and we can bring it back to youth in a way that that you and I can't. And repotting is one way to do it, the schedule.
And it's funny, I think so many trees in the country are on the upward trajectory in terms of they're still developing basic primary and secondary branching, and we're not really worried about getting them too refined. But I know you found this and I found this, where it doesn't take that many years once you get the density you're looking for, where you actually have to start pruning more so you can get a better response. You have to repot more frequently to wake them up a little bit. And so more and more, my most refined trees, I'm having more trouble waking them up and reinvigorating them than I am trying to get them super duper refined. Because if we keep following the same advice that got us to where we are, those trees are going to go down, 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 down. And
the advice changes.
If you can cut back a branch on any species, cut back one and get two. You just can't do that forever.
Right. You run out of space.
That's right. And so it's that means that we have to do the hard thing, which is pay attention to the needs of that individual tree. And
and I think so. I'm the same way going on in the roots. I'm sorry, I'm just sort of relating that. I mean, you run out of space in your pot as well, and there's only so much you can ramify really, and then you got to cut some away and introduce a little more space.
Now, what's fun is I have found that working with the same trees for a very long period of time, you find that the difference. You either need to repot that tree every year or every other year, and it'll make a big difference. And just because they're insanely vigorous and the roots grow super hard, and you start to get relationships with species that might be exceptions to that. And I have one tree that really does better if I like a plum. Repotting it every single year helps. If I don't repot it a single year, it slows way, way down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of the sort of early succession plants, like some people, for years, decades ago, I remember hearing that you cannot grow birch in a pot, and it's not true. You can grow birch
Not
in
at
a
all true.
pot.
Yeah.
But a lot of these early succession, aspen, things like that. They may. I have a I haven't worked with them a lot, just a few times, but they feel like they might be on a really different repotting cycle because they're legitimately different kind of plants. Some of them grow, with runners and stuff like that, and they just have a very different. They're like communal plants, and I have a feeling that is interrelated with repotting time and how we handle the repotting. But that's the future investigation for me. I'm not sure where to go with. I have no conclusions yet.
But that connects to another topic I've been probably most curious about this year, which is extent in terms of how much root work to do at any given time.
Yes.
And
very
so
good point. Yes.
you worked with, and let alone the raw timing, like those are both topics I'd like to get to. In terms of the extent, you and I learned with Boone a little bit in the early days, then you learned very different approaches where there's the concept of what do you do when you first start working with a tree to get rid of that old soil or nursery soil or just neglected bonsai that's been really, really compacted. And I have had different approaches over the years, whether conifer, deciduous, can you bare root the tree? Do you do partial bare roots? Do you do other things? And I'm finding that to be the most engaging decision I'm making on given trees, because I've been acquiring a lot more developed and or neglected trees in recent years, and I'm radically changing what I've been doing for the previous 20 years as a result. I'm curious, like, I know, and I keep saying Andrew, because I know you're working with people's different collections, and so and I know the people you work with, Michael, you've been working with them so long, I assume the soil is just amazing by now. But when you start working with trees for the first time, it's a really different ball game, and to know what you can do to get the best response that first year is I find that one really interesting.
Yeah, I've with most of my clients, we've been doing this kind of general practice where we're whenever they acquire a new tree, we're repotting it, whether we think it needs it or not, just to kind of see what's going on, because we found a number of non-ideal things in the root system that we had no idea about. We were just repotting like a large imported trident, and it had, there was like just a big pocket of air right underneath the trunk with no soil in there.
Oh gosh!
And it was a trident, so it did okay. But if it was if it was a different species, it could have been really detrimental. And so I think I'm following that general practice here in my garden and with my clients' trees too. Is just whenever we get a new tree or acquire a new tree, just repotting it just to make sure everything is as it should be in the container.
It's kind of like a physical. You go to a new physician. You're like, okay, let's just do a once over here.
I hate buying trees in May because I have to wait so long before I can repot them.
Yep.
I mean, I'm the same exact way, Andrew. It makes such a difference. And what's funny is if you have a tree that's a little bit weak, but you know the person you got the tree from, and by all appearances, it looks like it's all good soil, it's so hard for me to not repot in those cases, because until you see it with your eyes, it's hard to trust that things are the way it needs to be inside. And even more so, if it's a weak tree, if you're not repotting because you assume the right work has been done, that means the only tool you have is watering. And that's it. Beyond like basic exposure stuff, it just really limits what you can do to turn that tree around.
Right. Yeah. Greenhouse. So yeah, they're not many. Yeah. Watering. That's about it.
And I found, so typically I've worked with a lot of deciduous trees where when you get a deciduous tree, you can bare root it. And so when you had that trident, Andrew, did you bare root that tree?
No, I've with older plants, I've been leaving as much root on there as possible, assuming the soil is good. I had some bad experiences last year where I bought some trees that were weak, and I was a little aggressive on the repotting and bare rooted a little too much, and I actually lost a tree. But yeah, I'm learning to be a lot more cautious with really weak old deciduous trees, because I find once they really slow down and start throwing a lot of branches and then their health gets compromised, I find that it's a really slow arc to bring them back, and you can't really rush that.
That's exactly what I found last year. It's funny, for 20 years, I found it mostly okay to bare root deciduous trees. And then I did the same exact thing you just described. I bare rooted several really old and relatively weak trees, and they do not respond well. If a tree is super healthy, it will respond to bare rooting much, much, much better. I don't really worry about it a whole lot in most cases. But unless the tree's firing on all cylinders, I totally agree. The concept of bare rooting an unhealthy deciduous tree is a big gamble. I have no interest in doing that ever again.
Yeah, this is, it reminds me of a conversation I had in Japan years ago with Suzuki. I remember him telling me that with a young plant, and this was kind of interesting. It's not at all a contradiction of what you two said, because I've had the same experience, of course, which has made me very leery to bare root any deciduous tree unless it's young, and really vigorous, like you were saying, Jonas. But one thing he said, which is another facet to this thing, which I thought was really interesting. It was sort of a young versus old, how you handle a root ball. And he said, if you have a really young tree and you take off too much root, you can just stall it out. It just has no momentum coming out in the spring. And you can cut off more on, now you retaining, his assumption was that you're retaining this inner core that's full of fine roots, but you can take off about half the root mass. On the young tree, you might only take off a third. It was a really interesting conversation. And now, having my own garden for 15 years, I agree with that. That totally makes sense to me, to not be so aggressive with the young trees. And John, I think, has been working with so many young ones. You probably don't do an awful lot of cutting on your seedlings.
Right.
On the root system, you try and retain a lot.
Yeah. I think same as Andrew. Oh, sorry. Same as Andrew, like trying to do more frequent repottings on the young stuff just to get roots set, but maybe not be as aggressive for some things.
One tip I learned this last year, actually from John, was the benefit that a heat pad can really provide. Some of the trees that I did bare root last year that I shouldn't have, I'm convinced they only survived because they went onto a heat pad afterwards, and then that can be such a saving grace with a tree that you repot that you're quite uncomfortable with how it went.
Yeah, and I think that probably has a lot to do with our season, the way our seasons work here, because we have such a slow to start summer. Yeah. Where, last week it was 65 in the yard, and this week it's going to be 40 in the yard, and next week it's going to be 45 in the yard. It's just like, when is the right time to repot where we're not too late, but we're also not too early, and so that's an interesting part of our microclimate here, I think. But yeah, heat pads I think are very useful for especially weaker trees to be able to get the bump of roots.
And that's the start of a conversation of aftercare. I mean, how do you how do you take care of your plants after repotting? Definitely protecting from frost, from freezing, wind. I know many people protect from sun. They put it in the shade, and not necessarily. Some sun is good, because that'll energize the top, either to throw out a shoot if it's a deciduous tree, photosynthesize if it's an evergreen, and that helps regrow the bottom. So, to what John is saying, one way to really slow down a tree badly is to put it into the shade right after repotting. You want some warmth, you want a little bit of sun, you don't want too much of either. A greenhouse might be a good idea if you have it. Something like that can help an awful lot.
So back to the timing thing, we talked about how to tell over different years when the tree is ready, but when do you tell in the given year where you've decided that this is the year to repot? What are the telltale signs that now is the time to repot?
There's been a lot of talk about this. I've heard from other people around the country, a lot of ideas going around about what's the ideal time, whether it's in terms of comparing to when the tree is about to start growing, do we do it before that, close to before that, right at that time when we see visible growth, or do we make sure the tree's active before we start doing that? And I've heard the most interesting reasons, I'll say, as to why we might choose one or the other. And I'm curious if you all have heard or any of that from anyone lately.
No.
Enlighten us, Jonas.
Please.
Well, it's ideas about if trees are storing resources in the roots, do you wait for them to kind of shuttle those resources out of the roots before you repot? That's the hypothesis I've heard. And I'm very curious, what roots are coming off when you're repotting, and what resources are stored in which roots? The way I do it's been pretty consistent in that. It's funny, you learn a lot of stuff living in a mild climate, because some trees, the roots will grow all winter long.
Right.
And this is temperate species. Like often pines will show fresh roots every day of the year down here in the Bay Area. Right. And what I don't like about waiting for the trees to be active is that if in general, at least where I live, the roots are almost always moving before the top of the tree moves. And so if I wait until I see visible growth, that means when I open it up, there's going to be a whole bunch of new root. And I just cannot think of a hypothesis why I would ever want a tree. I can't say to a tree with a straight face, please develop a bunch of new roots so I can cut them off so you can do it again a second time in the new soil. I always want to throw good after good, where I trim the roots right before they start growing so that we're throwing good after good. And when the tree becomes active and throws those new roots, it goes straight into the new soil. That's how I've always thought of it. And I would love to know if you can think of any kind of contra way of doing it.
No, I like that. Yeah, repotting a little early so you're not cutting off all kinds of new growth down there. Makes sense. Just to back up and talk about where the plant stores its sugars, or in the winter it's starch, and then in the spring it turns that into sugar. But it's in the wood, and wood is everywhere, right? It's up in the trunk, it's in the branches, it's also in the large roots. But
large roots,
as far as I know, it's not in the small roots. So I think you could repot. You're cutting off mostly, just several-year-old roots, which aren't going to store a lot, I don't believe. So, because as I understand it, your starches are stored in the ray cells, and the ray cells are like these transverse elements that go perpendicular to your rings. So, and that's going to be in chunky stuff. So repot just a little earlier, and then keep your tree a little warmer after that to help it push it into growth. I'm with you, Jonas. I think cutting off all the new growth maybe isn't great. There are some trees that they don't seem to respond well, after they're really pushing anyway. After the growth on top is going, as you're saying, the roots start first, and then you see the growth on top is usually what happens. I think the old gardener suggestion of repotting when you see bud swell is probably a good guideline. There are some trees like beech, if they've fully leafed out and you do a really aggressive potting, or not fully leafed out, but if you have shoots coming out, that might not be great. Whereas trident maple, sometimes they repot when the trees have little shoots on them already and tiny leaves to slow the tree down because they're so strong. You might do that with an Amur maple or something else that's just a really, really strong tree. So that's a little bit of finessing, and getting beyond where we started with this conversation.
Well, and there's another really interesting way of looking at that, which is one of the funnier things that Daisaku told me is, you can repot a pine any day of the year. It's just how aggressive can you be with the root work, and how stressed do you want the tree to be?
Right.
And so if we know that repotting a tree aggressively in the middle of summer, when the tree has the greatest need for transpiration, in other words, the heaviest reliance on the roots, and we assume that's going to be the most stressful thing you can do, and if the least stressful thing is doing it right as it's waking up, are we thinking that it's an even curve in there, or is there some magic bubble that's outside of that curve? Because that's what it would take if we believe that We want the tree to be at a different point. We're just believing there's some physiological anomaly in this curve of, we know this is more stressful, less. This is not at all, but there's a magic bump that we're trying to time. And I have no idea if that bump is there or not, but that's kind of what that hypothesis relies on.
I think it's fascinating. I mean, Daichan is right. You really can. You can do anything almost any time.
Yeah.
But I don't encourage people to do that for a whole bunch of different reasons. For one, if you're working with an old tree, certainly the energy in the spring, when it's naturally going to start growing, is a great time to regrow your roots. It's a great time to repot. On the other hand, there's lots of other sub themes going on here. After growth ends in late spring can be a fairly good time to repot if it's essential, if it's necessary. There's
and it's
some
a gentle repot.
Yeah, I translated an article years ago. I think you wrote something about this, John, about repotting chochibai in the summertime after they've flushed out. And I'd never heard of that until I translated this article. I was like, oh my gosh, that's a neat idea. So I've been doing that for a while. It works. You defoliate and you cut back and whatnot, but it can work. It can actually work really well. In 5 days, I see new buds coming on. It's crazy little plants. But then there are the collectors. You talk with people who are collecting in the mountains, and after the needles have grown out, and so all the growth has happened, and you collect the tree, and it explodes with roots once you get it in a pot. The heat of the summer can help. So if you're going to repot out of season, you got to control your environment really well, I think is a greenhouse or something.
The other funny thing I found is after hearing that advice, I very cheekily thought, oh, well, then it should be totally safe to repot after decandling. And as always, it's not a test if you use a little baby tree, because they can do whatever they want. So I took a 13-year-old, my very favorite 13-year-old pine that I'd grown from seed, it was a really nice tree, decandled it, and did a fairly aggressive repot in late June, early July. I think the tree did better as a result of that.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah, did just fine. Now, I will say as a caveat to all listeners, I recommend that to nobody, but it's not impossible.
Interesting.
And so I don't know why there'd be a case when you'd ever want to do that, but it was interesting to know that a young tree that was really healthy, that was just overflowing with good resources, had been fertilized heavily, good aftercare, which we'll talk more about too. But that one really cracked me up when I saw, in fact, after seeing how bad the roots looked when I repotted it, they weren't as good as I thought, even though I'd grown the tree from seed and it had never been in bad soil. It was an exposed root, and there was a lot of these big aggregate things down at the bottom, at the very core of the root base. By tickling some of that out and getting some good soil down there, I essentially made the pot bigger, because whenever you replace bad soil with good, it's like a bigger pot within the same space requirements, and the tree seemed to love it. Bonkers.
That's a great story. Interesting.
All I have is jokes. So California allows you to tickle the soil out. Is that what you just said?
Oh, it's recommended. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they don't let us do that in Oregon.
Most people, well, in Oregon, there's more teasing. I think it's more nuanced teasing. Yeah. And here it's more of a tickle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. I like it. Which brings us to chopsticking.
Oh, all right.
We're weaving back and forth here. We didn't cover that when we were talking about soils. But one thing I've noticed, I just want to throw this out there. One thing I've noticed is that it's very exciting for people, I think, to kind of wiggle around. You stick your chopstick in the soil and you make this circle, right? And you kind of wiggle it around. You go back and forth, and that's helpful. But I do think the poke is as important, if not more important, because when you poke it into the soil, the chopstick, the sharpened chopstick that you have, or whittled piece of bamboo, whatever you've got, you poke it in there, and that's how you discover a hole. It goes in easy, you got a hole. It goes in, it doesn't go in very well, it's compacted in there, so you move on. So there's no point wiggling where it's compacted. So first is the poke, where you discover very little resistance. Then you can do a little wiggle, because that'll settle it in. And in a really tight spot, a wiggle isn't going to help you, but the poke will. That will push soil down into a space that's not much bigger than a particle of soil. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there. I see a lot of students doing this, and it's one of the comments that we make with
Well, and a lot of people describe them as equivalent alternatives, as if a technique is this abstract thing that has no effect on the physical world. And so if you kind of step back, as you described, and think, as you wiggle, what you're saying is that toward the bottom of that chopstick, depending on where the center of the radius of that wiggle happens to lie, how far away from the tip of it, then you start thinking, if the fixed point of the chopstick is the tip, then everything out near the surface is going to be moving back and forth, and it can't possibly get compacted. However, you're pivoting your wiggle, say, an inch or two away from the tip, then you've got a fixed point somewhere in the middle of the chopstick, and you're just waving it back and forth at the end of the chopstick. Now, if we were to build a case for when that might work, say there's a gap between two roots in a big pocket underneath, there might be a case for some wiggle to make sure it's compacted within that chasm. And so I'm kind of with you. I do at least 90-95% the poking. But I will say that there are cases when some wiggle can help out. But I'd say if people are kind of conscious about what physically is happening, and if you're just waving something back and forth, that can't possibly make something compact. You're whipping it up. Right. And the more whipping of the soil you do, you're just letting the smaller, heavier particles sink to the bottom and the lighter stuff go up to the top.
Oh, yeah. Right out. Another thing I see people doing is banging the pot. And that's also a useful technique. Banging, like if you have it on a turntable, you take your mallet and you hit the bottom of the turntable rather than like hitting an expensive pot with a mallet or
I haven't tried the turntable.
That's not a great idea. But it just helps. But I think of it more like, like finishing salt. This is, just banging isn't going to settle your soil enough. If you have pockets, they're still going to be there. Especially if you got some roots hanging out. So
what the bang
is the last thing.
Yeah, and that's when you've got the areas that you didn't chopstick because there's no roots there. It's if you've got large areas of soil where you didn't do any chopsticking, it will settle that stuff. But you're right, it's not going to solve a pocket. I'm still struck by that.
I saw one time on I think it was YouTube, someone had they have these jiggler tables for concrete to get the air out of the concrete. It's like an offset, and so I saw a vibrator. I saw someone using that for a repotting to jiggle the grains down into the root system.
And people regularly recommend a vibratory plate, something to just settle it all. And it, I would not want my soil to experience that, but. Because actually having used those vibrators in doing cement pours, knowing what happens if you overdo it, you completely destroy the integrity of your concrete. All the aggregate just drops to the bottom in a matter of seconds. And so it's a very careful thing, even with concrete. Right. But I was still struck by Andrew's story of the pocket under that imported tree. It's just because you've got a good tree doesn't mean it was handled the way you would want it handled. And just because it's someone's business to handle or to import really nice trees doesn't mean that they're going to be the way you want them to be. Because I've actually found a lot of the worst sins and big air pockets under the trunks about as bad as it absolutely gets. I've seen that same thing. It's creepy.
Yeah, that can make your tree wilt if it's a big enough pocket. I remember repotting a boxwood years ago back in Arizona, and I just sort of watched it as the leaves kind of lost their luster, and I was like, what happened there? And I took it out, and I had done a horrible job. There was this big pocket, and there was dry roots everywhere, and it was just hanging on. I'm sure it would have died if I hadn't repotted it the second time.
Speaking along the lines of chopsticking, this year I've been I'm working on a lot of young plants, both at some clients' houses and here in my garden. And I'm using, because they're all deciduous and they're so shallow of a root mass, I'm using the pressure of a hose to push soil in. And because we're doing so many of these, we're doing batches of 50 or so. So using pressure of the hose to get the soil into the roots that have been bare rooted has been helping and saving a lot of time. So that's
more about how you're doing that. That's like while you're potting it.
Yeah, I'm basically just taking this young seedling that has these nice horizontal roots. I'm putting it back in the container, I'm putting a little mound of soil on it and taking it to the hose, and I'm just using the pressure of the hose to wash soil into the roots. It saves me a ton of time, and I've done a few, not autopsies, but dissections, I guess, to see, is this actually working? And it works really, really, really well. Especially if you're using like a geodisc or a tile or something underneath there, so there's a hard surface for that water to kind of stop and that soil to kind of stop.
Interesting.
It's been working really well.
I wonder.
Yeah, I do something similar,
cool.
and I think it's the same as the vibrating table. Like if you do it too much, then the sizes will separate, or the bark will float, or the pump, whatever. And so it's kind of this fine line between we want to use we want to turn the soil to liquid enough to get in between the roots, but we don't want to do it so much that we're separating particle size and stuff. Because for little like 1 year seedlings, that it's similar. It works pretty well.
You guys are doing some fun stuff. I had never thought of doing that with young seedlings, and I don't know, Andrew, if maybe you got that idea from a story I told.
Yeah, with the Yamadori, right?
Yeah. So Suzuki got 3 pines. I think they were imported from Korea. They were Korean red pines, and they were gorgeous old trees, and they had bare rooted them. Not a speck of soil on them. They had these bright orange roots. It was really something. And this is one of these things, kind of like what Jonas just said about his decandled black pine that he repotted. I don't really recommend this, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. It's a really interesting idea. So these are old trees, not a speck of soil on them. And we took just pumice, so that might mitigate some of the thought problems that John raised of sort of stratification. So it was pumice, all of the same size. And we had a chopstick in one hand, a hose in the other, and actually a third person with like a scoop full of pumice, and dropping the pumice in, and then the hose on it, and then wiggling the chopstick. And the hose was pretty strong. It was a strong blast, not full on. It was kind of like half amount of water, but strongly flowing. And it was incredible. It's very, very gentle. I mean, if you think about it, you're not pounding away with a chopstick and doing all of this kind of aggressive, abrasive thing that pumice can do. The water was just very gently organizing all between the roots. And if you think of it, it makes a lot of sense, but it's the complete opposite of the way we normally work. And so I didn't know what was going on. I mean, my eyes were huge that day. I was like, oh my gosh, this is really bizarre. They all lived. They did fine. They were in a greenhouse. We misted them every day. And
I'm going to get a snorkel and try that.
Yeah, right.
It's wet, and you're doing it, in cold weather. So yeah, you're miserable if you're not in a wetsuit.
Well, that brought up a couple different things. That's super cool. I'm going to try something like that, Andrew. I kind of like that idea, because especially with young stuff, it's more of a nursery practice thing. What's the fastest, most effective way to get to number 100? But I'm curious, when do you guys get out the hose when you have older trees? When do you wash away, or is there any role for a hose when you're repotting a more mature tree, in terms of washing the roots?
I hardly use it at all. I'm only using it if I'm doing a partial bare root, and I'm really cautious to only get the half that I'm trying to tackle. But for really old bonsai, I'm really cautious to not wash any soil away.
I'll wash the soil away depending on the kind of the soil. When you get kind of 100% clay that's field soil, and it's just so gunked up and the tree and the roots might be a little wet to start with, you can't physically remove that stuff. As long as I know I'm not going to be washing everything away from the whole root ball, I will use the water. And I found 2 good things about it. One is it lets you see what's going on, because you're getting rid of that kind of veneer of the thin clay particles that are stuck onto the roots, and it can help clear out some of those areas. But the other thing it does is it can let you know where specifically there are drainage problems in a root ball. And I found I've repotted a bunch of really large forests lately, group plantings, deciduous, and they had this crazy 100% broken down field soil in the middle. And after doing the root work with various picks, hooks, sticks, it looked like it was good. And then when I kind of just gave it the smallest rinse to see what the roots actually looked like, I found there were these pools of water. After 2 hours of root work, there were still pools of water. And I would not have known that without the hose. And so I'm like, okay, guess I'm gonna have to perforate every centimeter of this whole thing. And I went back and cleaned it all up. Wow. And I found that's the most useful thing. But in general, you're right. I don't touch the hose that much, but when I'm dealing with an old, complicated root system with lots of large overlapping things and really bad field soil, and I'm not bare rooting, then it's a great situation for the hose. I'm just finding that a lot this year.
Yeah. We tend not to use the hose too much either. With a really young maple, maybe if you're trying to organize the roots or something like that, a vigorous plant. But usually, we really. I'm always kind of leery about hoses. If an area is where you see roots that are blackened, that's root rot. That's when they're dead, and then cutting away and then washing that little area, not the whole root ball. But that tends to help. But one of the reservations I have with a lot of water blasting away, doing that too frequently as something that rather than using hooks and chopsticks and all that. The problem is that it is then the second part, which is putting it back in the pot. Is that then you have this wet root ball, and unless you've let it drain, maybe tamped it off with a towel or something like that, you have this water there, and these droplets that then will glom onto some soil that you put in there, and it can be a really easy way to create pockets, which if you're using dry soil and a drier root ball, will easily flow in between and make it's just something to keep in mind if you do need to wash, to be a little cautious about.
Yeah, and then the complexity of the root ball will have a big effect on that, because if it's kind of a two-dimensional root ball where everything comes out at a level, you'll have clean soil below and clean soil above. There's not as much in between. But if you have a deeper, more complex root system, then there'd be all kinds of opportunities for pockets in there. And that's something I'd be much less likely to want to rinse off in the first place, probably.
Right.
Good point.
Right.
So when, in terms of the containers you're using, how do you describe when a box is good versus a terracotta pot versus a bonsai pot?
Mm-hmm.
And what, like, how do you describe it?
Yeah, I think just for terms of deciduous, I think a box is always good. I think it works great for an old tree. It works great for a young tree, especially if the old bonsai is weak. It starts shedding some branches. A box is really, really effective to reinvigorate it. But when I look at photographs from Ebihara's garden, Oishi's garden, I see both really young bonsai in boxes, really old bonsai in boxes, everything in between. So I think it's always a good idea, especially lately. I'm finding I much prefer a box rather than a pot that might not necessarily be the best choice aesthetically.
Absolutely.
So just putting it into a box until you can find that perfect container.
Absolutely. Otherwise, your visitor will be like, "What were you thinking?" Gosh.
Yeah.
They never think that about a box.
So how do you describe the benefits of box?
I think the biggest benefit of the box is you don't necessarily have bigger soil mass, because we usually build them to be the same size or same-ish size that the pot would be. But I think there's a much faster wet-dry cycle. And when the plant can dry out faster, when it can get rehydrated appropriately, that faster wet-dry cycle really produces much more rapid plant growth.
Is that because of the wood holding less moisture?
I'm not entirely sure. I think it's because, if the wood holds less moisture, boxes typically have much better drainage. So
the drainage is good. That's one benefit. Because I was trying to think of that. If we were to enumerate the actual differences between a bonsai pot and a box, the biggest benefit of the box is you can make it the exact size you need it, which can be really handy. But that's a minor thing in the big picture, because you might have a pot that's the perfect, slightly oversized. You can get more drainage in it, which you can kind of fake with terracotta or ceramic pots. But in general, you can put tons of huge drainage holes in the bottom of the wood boxes, which is great. Now, in terms of the insulative capacity or the fact that they can hold water, that's where it's like it's harder to measure, but I know that there's a lot of differences between those things. And is it the fact that there's water in the container wall I mean, there is in terracotta too, if it's a terracotta versus, say, a high-fired pot. And I'm just curious, are there other magical properties of box beyond the size, the convenience? Is there extra? I can see Michael thinking.
I was thinking back on your comment, Jonas, about not seeing really green needles using pure pumice, and in a box, for whatever reason, maybe it's just volume, more roots, whatever. I get green needles in pure pumice, very, very green, which is interesting to me. It's but maybe that's the helps support this engine that helps throw off diseases and allows us to build our trees faster, and many of the other benefits that happen in a box. But yeah, there's a little bit of magic there, I guess. maybe there's some real
because
questions.
we can quantify the differences in terms of which one dries out more. Because what's interesting, Andrew, what you're saying about the dry out cycle, I'm a huge fan of letting trees dry out more and letting them get drier than people think before you water again. Which gets to probably my last question. But you also having those shallower boxes is a smaller water column, which means there's actually a higher percentage of water in that shallow container than there would be in a deeper container.
Right.
I think the caveat with the boxes that I'm building, though, is I'm not putting just a few holes. I'm putting 20 or 30 holes into each box.
Oh yeah.
Actually enough so that I don't have to use any drainage screen. I make my holes small enough so that my drainage particle can't go through it.
Yep.
Is just kind of a cost saving mechanism. But also I think I think having 30 small little drainage holes means that there's water that's not really pooling up anywhere. Unlike a shallow pot where you're going to have, it'll drain out really well where you have the holes, but there's big gaps where you don't have drainage holes. And I think water can really tend to collect in those areas.
Yeah. And so let's say we've got an old root ball and half the soil's crap and half the soil's great. How do you tell people to water that? Because that's one of the most common questions I get. Well, do I keep that old soil in the middle healthy, or do I keep all that stuff on the outside healthy? And I usually just say, well, which roots do you want to live?
Yes. Yeah. That's pretty much my angle too. I say water for the soil you want.
And the rest just kind of magically takes care of itself. It's funny because it's one of those things where there's not going to be a logical answer for it, but you still have to make decisions when you're holding the hose, whether or not you're going to wetter or drier.
I mean, one thing also on the box is that we'll sometimes change the soil composition for the outside of the box, the edge, when we go into a box, just to kind of help invigorate the tree. So that's another. I mean, you could also do that in a pot, but a box, we can add a different soil composition, and then it just kind of reminds us to take the soil composition back down to the core when we go back into a pot, so we can play with that a little bit more, I think, in a box than you could in a bonsai pot.
Yeah. And to Andrew's point of the turnover, the fast wet dry cycle, I think minimizing your box, because any box is going to probably have a lot of it's going to have a lot of moisture, or excuse me, not a lot of moisture, but a lot of volume. It's very common to oversize the box, and to keep it just sort of that it's an inch and a half in all dimensions larger. That's usually more than enough.
I think my favorite pots of all time were, if I'm recalling this right, at Ebihara's garden, where the trees were just on asphalt, and it looked like there was a ring of drainage mesh, and then the soil just poured in, and that was it.
That's even simpler than Andrew's, drill from the bottom, which is a great minimalization. I like that, but those are hilarious. All I've seen are the photographs, but they make me laugh every time.
Yeah, because the water's going to drain out the side. It's not going to pool too much right there.
But the thing is crazy. I mean, asphalt is oil, it's
weathered asphalt,
me. But then you see these huge,
right? These trees are 6
extensions going off the top.
This is great because the county is actually making me pave a driveway here in my new house, and so now I'm going to have this asphalt driveway. So now I know exactly what I need to do with it.
Just let the tar and everything, let all the petrochemicals gas off first.
Yeah, exactly.
You could probably
Oh,
put
man.
divots in the driveway where you have little like potholes,
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Nice.
I like it. So we got a lot of good options. Well, I think now I'm armed to start facing the daunting task of the hundreds of small young
Yes.
trees and everything else. We didn't even get to really in detail the containers. I know I have so many different kinds of containers I'm using as well this year for the young trees, whether small plastic pots, small plastic baskets. I might try some fabric containers. They're let alone the discs that you mentioned earlier. There's so many different things to go with in containers. I'm trying as many as possible this year and just keep the experiments going.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Report back, please.
Is anyone using any interesting containers for older bonsai this year?
I've put 20 plus year old trees in colanders and don't really have any problem with that. It's kind of like the way a box is good for any old tree. What I guess in all of these cases, if it's funny, when we have an older or weaker tree, we want that thing to dry out faster. That seems to be the number one important point. And I was reading a great article from the nursery industry about this, where he was kind of joking. He wasn't joking. He doesn't want to pay his employees to water the trees. He wants to pay his employees to ensure the trees reach a specified dry point between waterings.
Excellent.
And it's just such a great way of
perfect.
thinking about it. And so when I think of the containers, I love the idea of any container that's going to help the trees dry out enough, because if most people repot too frequently, which is going to just really, really weaken the trees. Like if you see everything looks like it's done right and the tree's not growing, it's almost always because too many roots were cut. And same thing in terms of watering. Most people probably water, I'd guess, double what they could be, especially for their conifers and to some degree, even the deciduous.
To some degree, yeah. And I would add to that, oversizing containers is a big problem. If they don't go too small, it's too big, and then the tree can't dry out, and then you end up with physiological slowdown.
Yeah, it just goes slower. And so, no. What about you, Andrew? Have you thought of any creative containers this year?
No, I as Michael and John know all too well, I've spent the last couple of years just hoarding a really simple, basic glazed containers. I was living in a 10 by 10 foot room, and I had 75 20-inch plus pots in this room underneath the bed. It's stacked up on the sides. So I'm still working my way through those, but I'd like to experiment with some more kind of avant-garde things. So maybe in the future.
Great. Yeah, I want to see more cement pots. I want to see more big pots. We just need all kinds of containers. I'm finding now it's really hard to find exactly the container you need. And so the most creative things I'm doing are I've yet to start using cutting boards. I'm sure that's right around the corner. But I'm kind of thinking as the pots as a platform. If I don't have the right pot, and I'll mound things up as high as possible. I've been rebuilding a number of forests lately where I take them apart and put them back together. And if I don't, these trees were not treated to the root work they could have received over the years. And so I'm often mounting them up 3-4 inches above the edge of the very shallow pot, and just trying to get more and more creative with how I'm incorporating long grain sphagnum moss to keep it all from pouring off the sides, and or treating it with real moss on the outside. So I'm getting much more creative in how I've been using these things, but that's more resourcefulness than true creative new directions. It's like, how do I make this thing work?
Right. The mother of invention. Yes.
Well, I'm glad you all had the time to talk things related to repotting today. Thank you, John, for encouraging us in this vein.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it was a great subject.
Yeah, it was fun.
Timely.
And as always, I think it brought up more questions than it did answers. So we've got a few more things to mull about over the next couple.
Apologies to our listeners.
And I can think of so many products that'll love to sponsor this episode, John. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Wonderful. Yes. Yeah, we look forward to that.
All right.
Alrighty.
Thank you all. We'll talk to you all later.
Okay,
Cheers all.
great.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
The music on today's podcast was brought to you by the fine folks at Blue Dot Sessions. Check them out at www.sessions.blue. Also, the advertisements are fake. Good morning, Andrew.
Morning. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Great.
Echo, echo, echo.
Is there an echo in here?